I guess that this time I won't do an introduction or just one sentence or something like
Yeah,
that. Last time I did 3 or 4 sentences. I mean, it's already too much. So, uh,
whatever you want to
yeah,
do.
yeah. But
We're
but
here
I
for the conversation.
but I have the books here to show
Yeah.
to the camera. So, yeah. Oh, I haven't read this one yet. So
Well,
I
the
have to
second one,
confess.
the second one came out too. Right.
Oh, when?
May.
Oh,
This
I
is the
didn't.
sequel to not the sequel, but it's Savage Island was the teaser novel for it, and this is like the big, thick, epic fantasy book.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah,
So
I thought that all the books would be like this one. I mean, in terms
yeah,
of
they're all. I
like,
mean, I write in two different genres. One is the sort of Cold War thriller genre, and Welcome to the Hotel Yalta is more noirish than the Bone Church and the Hungarian, which are more like historical spy thrillers.
mhm,
And then Yalta is pretty like dark, and
mhm,
those have their darkness too. But Yalta is just like nothing good happens to these people.
yeah,
And then the Breath series, which is more that's kind of in the fantasy realm with like
mhm,
historical and romantic elements.
yeah. So this saga is going to have a lot of world building, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
the Breath series. It's it's built on a world that is sort of an ancient pre-Sumerian civilization, which is the civilization that the main characters are born into. They're these recurrent souls, who keep getting
Hmm.
reborn. But then every other book takes place in a different time. I'm about three-quarters of the way done with the first draft of the second book, which is called Of Sand and Bone, and that takes place in Cairo in 1902 during the golden age of archaeology.
Hmm.
And Savage Island takes place in 1944. And it also partly takes place in present day in Cairo and here in Virginia, where we live, with UVA being here. One of the characters is an archaeology professor there. So, and there'll be a third big book, maybe a fourth, and then I'm going to have several of these novellas. Well, they're a little more than novellas. They're barely novels, like Savage Island, barely novel length, that address different lives and kind of drop little clues about the mystery, the overarching mystery that these characters kind of are immersed in and have to solve. So
Yeah.
so
So
there's a lot.
you've already determined the number of books.
I think it's going to be three big books and then several of the smaller books, but there's a possibility that there will be four big books. It depends on if I'm able to tell the story in three books without it being too cumbersome.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm going to be able to, but I always like to leave a little wiggle room because, especially when I'm building worlds like this, when sometimes you get into a story and then you get into the second part of the story and you realize there's more to it than you originally plotted and planned. And it's this discovery process,
Yeah.
that's really fun and enriching and I kind of have to follow that to some extent. It's a push and pull of plotting and letting the story unfold on its own and following it, following the characters around, following what my original ideas for the story, which can have little offshoots and things that happen. I mean, it's so funny. When I was writing, as I started writing of Sand and Bone, as I started plotting it out, I plotted it out. I plot very loosely. I'm not one of those people who write detailed outlines. What I do is I write maybe two, three paragraphs of what's going to happen roughly in each chapter.
Yeah.
Um, Chapter one, they go to Cairo,
Hmm.
they meet this person, stuff. Sometimes a scene will come to me and I'll write in the scene because I don't want to forget it. And
Hmm.
I think that's a great idea for a scene. But mostly it's just sort of these short paragraphs of what's going to happen. But I realized as I started actually writing the book, suddenly Jack the Ripper became a character. And I thought, how the hell did that happen? But it worked, and I really liked it, so I've kept it so far. And stuff like that happens, I mean, you just don't know. Sometimes Jack the Ripper shows up, sometimes somebody shows up, and then I write to that. So
yeah. I mean, I was just thinking about George R. Martin, because when he started this series, he thought it was going to be a trilogy, but then it became it turned into four books, and in the fourth book, A Feast for Crows, he basically introduces a lot of new characters and places, and now he doesn't seem to be able to
just stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's true, and I relate to that, and I mean, you can see that in the Outlander series as well, which I think it's going to end up being 9 or 10 books. And if when you read the first 3 books, you can kind of see it as a trilogy. That it was sort of supposed to end right there, but not really, and then it just goes on and on and on and on, and you end up following these characters throughout their lives and into old age.
Yeah.
And
I mean, and it's interesting because there are people that really, I mean, are able to create entire universes. Like, I mean, last time I think we touched a little bit on this, but I mentioned that ongoing 20 plus years series, a Japanese series called One Piece. That I mean, it's massive. It has almost 1,000 chapters now, and it will last for at least 5 more years, according to the author. So yeah, it will be close to a 30-year ongoing series. I mean, it's amazing. I don't know how much authors have to plan ahead when they are creating this sort of big story that involves lots of different places and lots of different characters, because I guess it's very hard not to have some flaws there, inconsistencies, for example. I mean, it's really, I would imagine that it's really hard. I'm not an author, really much less a fictional author, but I guess that you have to keep up with lots of things at the same time, right?
I'm actually rereading both Savage Island and Breath, the book that I showed you right now, because now that I'm about 3/4 of the way done with this draft of the second book. And what's interesting is how, at least this time, this draft feels so complete. I mean, I feel like I'm not going to have that many iterations of it, whereas, the first book that you write can have 12, 13, 14, 15 drafts sometimes of the first draft, because you're trying to figure out the world, and you're trying to, understand the characters and sort of the mechanism behind it all, right? And that takes some tinkering. It's like a Swiss watch. But once you have that watch going, it's a lot easier to, if you know where you're going with the story, it's a lot easier to write to it. But you forget things. You do. You forget things that you've written, and it's amazing to me reading them now. And because I mean, I am obviously, when you've written it, you're very familiar with the story, and you've edited it and re-edited it. But as I read it, it's almost like I'm reading somebody else's work sometimes, because I forget that I wrote a lot of it. You just kind of forget being in that place, in that zone. And it's an incredibly necessary part of world building, I think. I mean, I really don't know what other authors who world build and aren't just writing either standalone novels or just sort of quick genre series. I don't know what their process is, but I can't imagine that it doesn't involve reading and rereading their work ad nauseum.
Mm-hmm.
Because you just can't keep track of it all unless you have some kind of supersonic memory, which I don't. It's impossible to keep track of it. I mean, I can't keep track of what I watched on Game of Thrones in season 1, where I'm like, wait a minute, what did the, no, remember that was when remember when John saw that guy, and now there's an echo of it in season 6, and I'm like,
Yeah.
no, I don't remember that at all, but okay. And then you go back and rewatch it and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. There's that character again.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine that people who do things like George R.R. Martin, Tolkien, or even
Yeah.
the author of One Piece. Uh, One thing that goes through my mind when I think about that is that they might have an entire room whose walls are full of post-its with all with all the trajectories and all the characters and all the traits that each character has. And I mean, in the case of Oda, because it's basically a series that directed at children mostly, but so
Yeah.
it has fights and things like that, and it's interesting because he also has to keep up with a sort of power scale between the characters, and I mean it's really hard to do so. I guess. Because I mean, one can think that, oh, okay, this is just a series for kids. It's not that hard to create, but it is. It is very hard to create.
It is. And, kids remember everything.
Yeah.
And they're, they so immerse themselves in these worlds. And so you have to be meticulous, and that is so funny. Yeah, you imagine an entire room full of post-it notes. There is a program that you can get that's kind of like a writer's program where you can organize your thoughts, and you have like post-it notes. I mean, obviously it's all done on your laptop or whatever, but I find it really confusing. I can't stand the program. A lot of people swear by it. They love it. Um, but it's too difficult for me. I would rather like do the post-it notes or go back and reread through the book at roughly where I think the place that I'm looking for is, because I don't know. It's having multiple windows open and going back and forth and then finding, where I'd put it, just seems like it in order to make your life simpler, it overcomplicates it.
Yeah. But by the way, let me ask you more about the way you go about creating a story or a
Hmm.
world for a book or a series of books. Uh, uh, I guess that's very interesting, and I would imagine that each author would have his or her approach. But where do you start? I mean, do you first think about the characters? Do you think about the story in terms of who will meet who, where, when, the kinds of interactions they're going to have? Do you think about the places they should go to, and I mean the localization of each place or something like that?
Um, all of those things,
Yeah.
but I mean, I find that kind of my process has changed, which I'm sure is the case for anyone who learns a skill, right? Whether
Mhm.
you're learning the guitar or, learning how to write long form like a novel or a nonfiction book, whatever it is, it's it's kind of a skill that evolves and you figure out what works for you. I mean, I remember when I was writing my first novel, it really did start with a character and a place and time,
Yeah.
because I had just come back from living in Prague. I was very steeped in my family's history in the Cold War and in World War II. I knew so many Holocaust survivors that I'd met there. I it was it was a world that I was immersed in and I wanted to play with. I continued to want to play with. And I didn't even realize that it was going to turn into a novel. I really didn't. I'd never imagined. I'd written skits. I'd translated plays. I'd done things like that, but I had never said to myself, I'm going to sit down and write a novel. This is what I want to do. Um, and it just kind of evolved. I started writing this one character, and then suddenly his love interest came along, and and once I was probably, I don't know, maybe a third of the way into the story, like into the first rough draft of the story, that's when I started thinking about, oh, well, wouldn't it be interesting if um, I remember going to the Bone Church. My first novel was called The Bone Church. And maybe I was halfway through, I don't know, but I was like, I remember this place and it was so fascinating. I loved going. And it was so spooky. It was this ossuary right outside of Prague, or not, about an hour outside of Prague. And wouldn't that be interesting to make that a character in this story, that place a character? And, and there were just certain places that I wanted to take them to.
Mhm.
And certain stories that I'd heard while I was living there that I found interesting. And I wanted to see if I could play with them enough to make them a part of the narrative. Now, as I wrote other books, um, it became a combination of places I'd been to and places I'd never visited in my life, and that I just researched and kind of took, uh, you know, really got fleshed out in my own imagination. And I thought, well, I really want to take the reader somewhere else, because I feel like I'm getting stuck in a rut if I'm writing about Europe again. I need to leave Europe for a while so that when I come back to it, it's fresh. And that's when, with Savage Island, I had it set in the South Pacific on this island of Niue. I think it's pronounced Niue. Um, and I researched. I've never been there, obviously. I researched it. I looked at pictures. I watched documentaries on it. I watched traveler videos of people who put up their travel videos on YouTube, and read about it, and just did that. Um, so I think you get a lot more tactical and less focused on your own experience and describing things that you've actually seen as you start, or at least I do, as I start writing subsequent books, and I sort of run out of my own material from my own travels and my own sort of life experiences. They start informing rather than really embodying, maybe, what I'm writing, and and that's actually really fun too. I mean, that's really where world building comes in a very big way, because um, I think that it is. I was going to say easier, but that's not quite the word I'm looking for. When you're world building, that's where like the fantasy genre is just so built for it, because um, you're not necessarily describing a place you've been to. I mean, there might be elements of that. Um, the story may start there, or dip into places that you've been to, but ultimately you're showing your reader a place that doesn't exist anywhere but in your own imagination, and now theirs. And so writing the kind of the first book in a, a series that requires world building is a lot of work, because you have to think through this world and you have to paint it, and you've really got to consider every part of it, and it's got to come alive in that first book, or I think you're going to have a very hard time. I don't think you can just say, well, I'll just throw a dragon in here or whatever. You really have to figure out what belongs in this world and what doesn't. How how supernatural are you going to get? how fantastical are you going to get? What kinds of beasts, if any, are you going to have in this world, that are outside, the realm of our own sort of reality? You really have to build boundaries too,
Yeah.
and understand how far you're willing to take the characters, and how far you even can, given the narrative that you have sort of laid out and the sort of world that you've built. I mean, I've been reading this young adult series. I've only just finished the first book, and I'm going to read the second, but it's really wonderful. It's called Cabinet of Wonders, the first book. And a friend of mine gave it to me to read to my daughter, when she was sick in the hospital. And it actually takes place in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, and it's so Czech in so many ways, because this young woman has this tinkerer father, and her pet is a metal spider.
Oh.
And it's just wonderful. But it's things like that. It's got this very almost like an Eastern European steampunky feel to it, although I don't think it's steampunk at all, but it's got that feel to it. And it's figuring out what those strictures are, and how, well, yeah, I mean, how far you're going to go. I think that's a very, very big question when you're building a world, is how far are you going to go? Because I think that when you're writing fantasy, there does come a place where, no matter how fantastically you're writing, I mean, Tolkien is incredibly fantastical, and yet I think his world has tremendous boundaries to it. I mean, if he were to write something, or if someone, let's say if you're reading Tolkien fan fiction, you'd know immediately if this person was writing outside of the world, right? Even if, let's say, the character or species that the fan fictionist introduces is, equally fantastical to Tolkien's world, but you just know, there's a certain taste to the whole, flavor to the whole thing, where you're like, no, 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 no. No wolf man belongs in Tolkien. You know what I mean? There are no werewolves in Tolkien, for heaven's sake, or something like that. So it's figuring that out, and that's arduous. I mean, that takes a lot of thought in that first book, and then once you've got that laid out, it's a lot easier going forward, because the rules of the game. So it's just like, okay, here we go, another game of Monopoly. Maybe I'll land on Park Place this time, but there's nothing out, you're not adding things that don't belong anymore. You've played with that already. You've written the scenes that you love that you have to get rid of. The characters you might love that you realize, it's interesting, because this series, Breath, the sort of germ of it actually came about when I was writing my historical spy thriller, my first novel, The Bone Church, because it was a story that the love interest, Magdalena, in that story, that her father used to read to her when she was young. And I found myself going off on a tangent about this book that she loved as a young girl, this sort of fantasy story about this girl named Shirin, who, lives in this ancient culture and goes to live in this sultanry. And it was called The Sultan's Magic Slippers. And somehow the Sultan's Magic Slippers, which was a child's story and did not belong in that novel. I'm not even sure there's a reference to it anymore. I think I cut it entirely. It's possible that it's referenced, but just barely, and that turned into this sort of epic fantasy series that is much more geared towards adults, and it's not a child's story. So you just, never know. There's never, even when you write something that you end up cutting a scene or a character or an idea, it tends to rear up again later somehow in some different way, and tends to get repurposed, sometimes in a big way, like that.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about child stories, and the first thing that came to my mind. Do you know that story? I think it's from Germany or even Eastern Europe, the Pied Piper of Hamelin.
No, I mean I know what the Pied Piper is. Is that the same story? Is it just because the Pied Piper? Yeah, I know that,
The
but
one who has a flute
yes,
and
yes, yes. Oh
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. I thought you might have been talking about someone who was referencing the Pied Piper
No,
and you
no,
had
no, 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 no.
repurposed it in a different story. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, because it's supposedly a child story, but I mean, if you read it closely, even as an adult, it's an horrifying story. He basically takes all the children from a village or a town or something like that and takes them to inside the mountain, basically. So,
He's like Jim Jones from Jonestown. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. No, I know, and some of these are horrific. I mean, if you read the Hans Christian Andersen stories, the original stories, like The Little Mermaid, they're heartbreaking. They're
Yeah.
absolutely heartbreaking. The Little Match Girl is, I mean, I can't read The Little Match Girl and not get teary-eyed at the end. It's so tragic
Mhm.
and so sincere in its tragedy. You know, it's
Yeah.
there's nothing sort of flip about it, and it's such a small story about this one person, so it's so intimate. Um, yeah, I mean, it's really amazing. It's what I think the best children's fiction is incredibly dark, and that kids love dark places. They like to imagine going there. They're trying to imagine their adult lives. And well, there are plenty of kids who have to deal with very dark issues. So I'm not saying that, childhood is all fantasy land, um, and is all great. But, they aren't afraid to go there and to play with that. I think that a lot of times as we get older, that's when, we start to put our hand out and try to keep a distance from those very dark themes and get very protective of ourselves and of our children.
Yeah. Do you know Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese writer, a poet from?
You mentioned him
Yeah.
to me last time that
Yeah.
we spoke, and I have not read him yet, and I would like to. I haven't had much time to
Yeah.
read, unfortunately. But yeah, you told me about him.
Yeah, because he has a poem where he basically says that a poet is a liar because when he writes about a feeling, for example, he's writing about a memory of a feeling, and so he's lying about what he's writing. And then when the reader reads that feeling that he lied about, then the reader also feels his own feeling. So it's basically a lie of a lie of a lie, a series of lies. It's a very interesting poem. I think you would really like to
I
read him.
I
So
would really.
do you identify with that in any way?
Oh, absolutely. I think. I mean, it's so funny because I wrote about this in my newsletter last week about lies,
Yeah.
and how interesting lies are. When I first started writing my blog, God, like 9 years ago now, I can't even believe it. But I wanted to write about family lore,
Mm.
and because I have such a rich family lore, right, with all these crazy stories and very war torn and political prisoners and villains and heroes and damsels in distress, all this stuff I grew up hearing at my own table, and what was also fascinating to me were the lies told within that. And so I really wanted to tell the stories of family lore on my blog, um, and let the lies and the truths bubble up to the surface on their own and let them contradict one another and kind of through that process you almost come upon a greater truth. I had this close relative who when I was in my teens I discovered lied about everything. I mean, what she had for breakfast was a lie. And She told this incredibly harrowing story about her youth, about having been, kicked out of her house and taken in by nuns, and she very much wanted to become a nun, but then was forced to marry this man. And I mean, it was a really heart-wrenching story, and of course, I discovered that it was all BS. But the truth of her story was actually twice as harrowing and heartbreaking. But I think she just couldn't bear to tell it. So she told it in the form of a lie to get the sympathy she needed and to be able to tell it her way and to sort of redeem herself through her own story. When, like I said, when her real story was actually like, oh, I mean, absolutely jaw-dropping. This wasn't someone, making up tragedy.
Yeah.
They had experienced very real pain and very, very real tragedy, but had invented a whole other reality in order to get the sympathy they needed for their pain, because their own pain was too much to share.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the little lies of people who have their perfect Facebook life, and what a disaster, what a shit show it really is, and yet everybody is always happy, everybody's on vacation, everybody's celebrating birthdays and having a terrific time. And it's these sort of necessary lies, or people feel like they're necessary to tell in order to I don't know, maybe feel better about their own narrative somehow, transform it into a story that's more, palatable for them.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting idea. So, do you think that maybe people in their social networks are creating a fiction for themselves?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, writers do that very consciously, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, I mean, writers are generally, not always, but generally better on paper than they are in person, because we sit there and we think through everything we're going to say. It's not that necessarily what we're writing is not how we feel or how we really are, but it's how we really are at our best because we actually had time to sit down and think about it. You know what I mean? And if
it's like text messaging or something like that. You can go back and rewrite it.
No, I mean, if we all sat down and wrote out our day and really thought through every interaction we had with people, we'd win every argument. we'd have a loving experience with our parents or our spouse or our brother that we might be having some sort of argument with, but we'd end up hugging and kissing at the end of it all. Everything would be very different if we could just think it through before we actually endeavor to do it, right? But I think that with what you see maybe on social media, it's very different. You get a wholly different kind of fiction, depending on whatever the individual's pathology is. I mean, when you're, on Twitter, you see the people who like firebomb conversations, and they come in like stealth bombers and they just blow the whole thing up with insults and everything. And you think, God, we've given these people have power for the first time in their lives. They've got to, the people who do that must feel so disempowered in their own lives, because why else would you do it? Why else would you spend your whole day just getting in there and fighting with people that you don't even know, and, accusing them of all sorts of egregious things. I mean, it's interesting. I'm Catholic, and, in all my life, I've never encountered anti-Catholic bigotry. I mean, never. No one has ever said to my face, "You're a Catholic, I can't stand you, get away from me, you're not welcome in my home." Yeah. And I've never met anti-Catholic bigots. I knew people like had a problem with the Catholic Church. That's different. you know?
Sure.
But I encountered quite accidentally flagrant, like a group of anti-Catholic bigots on Twitter, and it was something to behold. I mean, it was fascinating. Um,
But were they religious people from other religion, atheists? Or...
no, they were religious people. They were, some of them were former Catholics who had seen the error of their ways, and they were all some branch of Protestant.
Hmm.
So it's not like they were in some weird religion. I think they were just, and I think if I met these people in person, I don't think they would have ever said the things they said to me. And by the way, this was all the result of a completely innocuous comment. I think I said something like, well, I went to Catholic schools. I mean, it was that innocuous. You know what I mean? Or I just mentioned the fact that, I'd gone to Catholic schools as a kid. And I almost never actually encounter that sort of awful Twitterness that people talk about. I don't post much. I don't really post politically. You've seen we're Twitter friends. You know what I mean? I like to talk about art. I like to post weird pictures. I like to laugh. I like to talk about humanity, and all of its sort of foibles and its glory, right? And that's very much me, and that's very much what I do on my Twitter feed and all that. So I don't get into arguments with people, and so I sort of somehow caught the attention just by saying I went to Catholic school, right, of these anti-Catholic bigots, and I was called evil.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said that I was not their sister in humanity, whatever that means.
Oh my God.
I mean, it just went on, and I was called that I worshipped false gods, and that I was an idolater, and I was like, you got all this because I talked about Sister Mary Margaret pulling me out of my chair by my ear? You've got to be kidding me, And it was really fascinating. You can see how people who are on, who talk about their lives and maybe their politics or their causes on Twitter start to feel very persecuted, because once you mention something like that, and somebody finds you, and that group of angry bees, find you, you're going to get stung. And so it's just it's interesting. That's all. And those people too, I don't believe that that's what they're like in their day-to-day lives. I don't believe it for a minute.
Yeah.
I think it's only like that on that medium.
Yeah. Since you mentioned that you're a Catholic, do you think that you being a religious person in any way makes you a better writer? Because there are some things that we associate with religion in terms of experiences and feelings, like, for example, awe and things like that. Do you think that there are certain things that are easier for religious people to experiment in terms of feelings and things like that, that atheists, that is harder for atheists to experience?
Possibly. I mean, I can say this, that having gone, to Catholic school for most of my life, most of my young life, and really being immersed in the stories of the Bible, for instance, was invaluable to me. I mean, it taught me the story arc, story structure. It taught me all the classical stories. It really, if I have never read anything but the Bible, it would have prepared me for a literary career. Mm-hmm. And one of my, YouTube videos for Love at First Write, I talk about how if you want to be a serious writer, get to know the stories of the Bible. You don't have to do it in a religious sense. But I mean, I'm shocked. And my kids have gone to Sunday school, but I'm shocked at how little they know the Bible, because it's no longer something that is talked about that much, and they also only learn it in Sunday school. We don't really have Catholic schools here in Virginia the way we did where I was growing up in the Midwest, where you had 10 parish schools to choose from just in your area. There were a lot of Catholics there. Here in the South, there are more Catholics than there used to be. But when my grandparents came to the U.S., they didn't settle in Virginia. They had a host family in Virginia. They went north because you couldn't find a job as a Catholic.
Oh.
That people didn't want to hire us, right? So, my kids aren't steeped in this, and as a result, you don't know the story of the prodigal son? You don't know the story of Job? No, who's Job? They just don't. They don't know, and they're at a real disadvantage in that way. Now, I think that they get readvantaged because I think with video games and all sorts of interactive stories and just how good television has become. Whereas we had, Happy Days, you know what I mean? And really generally very terrible TV when I was growing up. So they may be getting it from other places in that, but, in terms of just an excellent classical education, it is really hard to beat studying the Bible. Everything you need is there. Every kind of, and just mythology in general. I loved mythology as a kid. I loved Greek mythology and Roman mythology, but you also find all those stories in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. The Old Testament is just so rich with story after story after story about how we perceive our lives as humans, and it's how we perceive our story arc and what we are hoping for, what we are reaching for, how we stumble and fall, stories of redemption, stories of heroism and punishment, and I mean everything that you can find in a really juicy, exciting story is there. And as a kid, I was not a prolific reader like a lot of writers actually are. I was a prolific imaginer. Mm-hmm. I loved kind of making up my own stories, and even if I found a story that I really liked, read a story that I really liked, what I liked to do was then turn it into my story and make the characters do the things that I wanted them to do, and so I think that really being immersed from a young age in mythology and Bible stories, absolutely. I don't think I could be a writer without those. I don't think I could tell rich stories without that experience. It just, there's a fly in here. It would just, yeah. So I guess for me, yes. Do I think that an atheist could tell really rich fantasy stories, for instance? Probably. I think the difference between, because by the way, I've been an atheist, so I can kind of, so I think I can talk to that. And during my atheist years, interestingly, I was writing a lot more comedy and irony.
Yeah.
And as I started kind of coming back to faith, my work became, it still has a sort of darkly comic elements to it. I mean, that's just sort of part of my personality. I love dark humor, and I love comedy. I mean, I just grew up on it. I wanted to be Carol Burnett when I was a kid. I did. I mean, that was like my dream. What do you want to be? I want to be Carol Burnett. But as I kind of returned to faith, and I think also it coincided with falling in love and starting a family. That kind of makes you think about those things more. The work got more serious in terms of emotionally serious. And I think comedy is very serious. By the way, I think it has a very serious function in our society, and it's huge. I love it, and. So I'm not putting it down and saying comedy is not serious, but I mean, when you're writing about, um, love and war and political wars as well, and all of the stuff that tends to come alive in a fantasy story. Uh, if you're I think I do. Yeah, I guess the answer is yes. It allows you to go places that I rather, I'm not going to say anyone else, but that I, when I was an atheist, would look down on and would not
Yeah.
allow myself to go there because I just thought I was just a little too smart for it. That was me. I'm not saying everyone is like that. I think that certainly, I mean, most of my friends are atheists, and they're incredibly open people. And they probably more, and they're not militant. Most of them aren't militant atheists. They just don't believe. And um, I think they skew more towards nonfiction. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, you believe in God. Does it make any difference for you if the Bible is simply a fictional book, or at least what's told there is in some way fictional?
No, because I never took it literally. I think, and maybe it's because, I've always thought like a writer. Um, I understand that what I'm writing, when I'm writing my fiction, I understand that it's not literal, but I also understand that it tells a greater truth. It's trying to reveal something about the characters, about humanity, about my own feelings, about feelings I've witnessed in others.
Yeah,
And sometimes it's revealing things I don't even know it's revealing until after I'm done and I read it, or somebody else points that out to me. Because, you get so immersed in the story, you're not necessarily thinking to yourself, and here's where I'm going to introduce this highfalutin concept. It's, and if you, oftentimes you'll like if I read an interview with a writer, with a writer with a capital W, right, who has won serious literary prizes, and they say, and the interviewer will ask them some sort of academic question about their work, and that writer will be like, I don't know, I just wrote it. I really wasn't thinking about that when I wrote it, but yeah, I see why you think that's there, and I guess it is there, but I did not intentionally put it there. I was just trying to reveal whatever happened to come up when I wrote this particular circumstance. And did I have a theme in mind? Sure. But do other themes also emerge? Yes. And I guess, going back to your original question, that's how I look at the Bible. I think it is a way to understand ourselves. It's a way to understand the fact that, we have, as human beings, I believe at least, I think that we have a we tend towards the spiritual somehow and towards the religious. It depends on, what some people focus their religiosity, on politics.
yeah,
Others might focus it, I mean, on their career, and others focus more on religion. It just, but I think that we have that propensity as human beings. I don't think I've ever met anyone who doesn't have it. In,
yeah. I mean, even atheists, even if they don't believe in God, they believe in other things like justice, for
Mhm,
example, fairness,
mhm.
and I mean all of those secular
Environmental
values.
stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and justice with a capital
Jay.
J. So, yeah, yeah. So I mean, they're basically believing in something that doesn't have, let's say, a material form. So
Exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, it's a really curious question. It's interesting I think for the first time we have a lot of people who are openly agnostic or atheist in the
yeah,
culture. I think that, I think that these people have always existed, but perhaps just didn't share their views, because it wasn't wise to share them, even, and I'm talking about even pre-Christian times when you had, these temples built to the gods and you were making sacrifices and all of this. I think if you were the kind of person, and there were probably admittedly many fewer people like that then, because when you're living hand to mouth and the average life expectancy is 32 years, because you're probably going to die of some kind of infection, and most of your children don't live to adulthood. Everyone's in a foxhole in that situation, and there are no atheists in a foxhole. You figure, even if you're the kind of person who may have doubts, you're like, oh, well, you know what? I'm hedging my bets here. I'm praying because my kid is sick, because I'm not feeling well, and that means I could be dead next week. I'm starting to come down with a cold, or the flu. And so, we now have the comfort not to, for large stretches of our life, at least, not to be worried about our mortality every single minute of the day, even though it's coming. I mean, we're all going to die, and we're all going to probably get sick at some point, unless we just sort of drop dead. Or die in our sleep of some sort of natural strange defect. But I think that we're sort of in uncharted territory, because we now have the freedom to focus our religiosity on other things, and who knows what that's going to bring. I mean, what do you see in yourself? Because you've said that you're an atheist, but not a militant atheist. Where do you see your own passions directed? Your sort of religious passions, in quotes. Do you see it in yourself?
Yeah,
Science,
well,
maybe?
in my case, it would be truth with a capital T, because
Yeah.
I'm basically interested in learning new things and simply, going after the evidence, let's say. For example, I
Yeah.
love science, and
Yeah.
I'm not really that attached to my own values. For example, I don't have any big convictions, let's say. So it's very easy for me if new evidence points toward something that runs against my own values to accept it. You could say, in a sense, that perhaps science works for me as revelations work for religious people, or something like that. It's not in this case that we are simply expecting that some supernatural entity or something like that will bring enlightenment to our minds, and then we will find the truth about the world, but basically through empirical methods. But in a way, you could say that we are trying to understand the world. If you believe in God, and some scientists are religious, I guess that it can even be considered to some extent a spiritual enterprise, because you are putting yourself outside of your own experience, how you experience things directly. And there are many things that science tells us about that we can't really grasp. So there are, I guess, several metaphors here that we could do, and comparisons between the scientific endeavor and religious experience, I think.
I think you're right. I actually tend to look at science and truth very much like you just described. I'm not attached generally to any kind of out, you know, I'm willing to look at any evidence. You know, I'm willing to read um, any kind of contrarian, idea or point of view, whether it's religious or scientific. You know, that's I think what you describe, and I is very much the way Galileo would have seen science, and he was also a man of faith. And I think that I look at science and faith much like Galileo did, from what I've read. That for him, science was discovering how God made the world,
Yeah.
and not trying to go top down, saying God made the world this way because that's how the Bible says, or the way I think that's a very political way of looking at religion. If you're saying that can't be because that's not what God says, as if you know what God says, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's actually more political than spiritual, and that's someone who has a far more political mind than a religious mind, because I think that a religious mind is actually a very scientific mind. It, I mean, at its core, it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean that someone who has a scientific mind is religious, or that someone who's religious has a scientific mind. But I think that the core elements are very similar, and that it's not unusual for them to overlap. You know, I mean, the Czech monk, who is sort of the father of modern genetics, right? um,
Yeah, yeah, it
example of
was Gregor Mendel, yeah.
That's it. That's it. I always forget his name, and I shouldn't because he's a fellow Czech, but I do. Uh, it's it's a mess, isn't it? You know, it's a real mess of how we come to understand ourselves and live our lives, and we just kind of try to make sense of it in whatever way. Um, we are made, in whatever personality construct we have, and all of these different things come into play. Whether we are optimists or pessimists by nature, whether we're political animals or religious animals, um, whether we are tribal, or I don't even know what the opposite of tribal would be, how that would be described, whether we are fiercely tribal animals or whether we can kind of move more fluidly between groups, which I think I've always been that way. You seem like you're that way. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Yeah.
I could always, even as a kid, like I could sit at all the different lunch tables and
Hmm.
talk to whoever was there.
Yeah.
I felt comfortable doing that, and I think a lot of kids just sit at their lunch table, you know. No, these are my people. I'm a cheerleader. I sit with the cheerleaders and the football players, or I'm a science nerd. I know that about myself. This is where I belong. Um, Whatever it is, and
Yeah. I guess that one of the things that really fascinates me is that if you were to accept or to take science to its last consequences, you would be a nihilist in a way. I mean, in terms of, I mean, not believing in moral values, not believing in anything higher than yourself and stuff like that. But I guess that in my case, I have lots of empathy, and so it's hard for me to really try to not care about anything. So
yeah, but I think if there were no moral law, which I do think that there is a moral law, I do think that it's cross-cultural, and that there are simply certain core values that everyone but a true sociopath shares, regardless of how, I don't know, maybe analytical they are by nature,
yeah,
or or scientific versus spiritual, or whatever mix that we are. I think that is there, and that is what keeps us from going off a cliff. And ironically, I think it's also what keeps people who are maybe overly religious from going off a cliff too, because you can go off a cliff at either end, either with rapture, right? With religious rapture, or the sort of rapture of nihilism on the other side. And to some extent, we're seeing that in our very like highly partisan culture right now. I think that there are just as many people in the middle, but the people who are dominating the conversation are on are on the far sides. They're the crust of the bread that's dominating the whole loaf, and
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that moderates are not good at political activism.
no.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because moderates don't fall on either side of the political aisle. They fall close to the middle, and it's really hard. I mean, I'm a center leftist. I mean, I've done my political compass, and it falls a little bit to the left of center. But I mean, and it's really hard for me to identify with a political tribe. I mean, I have my values, I have the causes that I think are worth fighting for, but it would be really weird for me to be part of a political party, for example.
Yeah, I tend towards that too. I mean, I was talking to a friend here the other day, and I was saying how I'm getting bombarded with text messages from both Democrats and Republicans. And she said, "Why do you get bombarded with both? I only get the Democrats." And I said, "I don't know." Because I really can't answer that, but they figured me out. You know what I mean?
Probably it's your internet activity.
It's probably my internet activity, exactly. Democrats think I'm a Democrat, Republicans think I'm a Republican. And I said, I think I'm doing something right. I don't know if we've had this conversation. I can't remember if we got into it last time, but we don't tell our kids how we vote.
Yeah.
And we're not going to tell them until they're 18 and of voting age, and we try very hard to play devil's advocate, even on issues that we feel pretty passionately about. We really try to argue the other side in a sort of smart and reasonable way to show them that there is another side, that there's always another side, and that you never take, what you've read on the internet or a certain point of view at face value and just decide that that is the point of view. You always look at the other side, and you never vilify the other side, because usually, unless you're dealing with a true villain, and those are rare,
Yeah.
but they exist. Sorry, I have this fly who keeps bugging me.
Well, I guess that the other side is right sometimes.
The others, exactly, and you always have to keep that. You always have to keep that in mind, and it's really funny because our kids are always trying to guess who we're voting for, and going back and forth. So I think we did something right because they can't figure it out either. But I think that has taught them to be real thinkers. I'm very happy with how that's turned out, and we didn't immediately, when we had kids, we weren't like, and we're not going to tell them how we vote. It wasn't like that. It just sort of evolved more as, we saw how contentious the sort of public conversation, the public discourse got, and how really nasty and partisan it was getting. And so we just sort of started talking about it one day, and we're like, this doesn't sit right with me. I don't like this. And so we're just, we're going to go about this a different way. And I think, like, my closest friend is kind of horrified by that, because I don't think that she is capable of not trying to inculcate her daughter into her worldview. Mm-hmm. But it's really I think she feels that her daughter would be too vulnerable to evil, basically. I think she looks at politics in a very religious way.
Yeah.
And we've actually had the opposite experience with our kids because it's actually made them very resilient and it's made them very nuanced thinkers. And it has not made them susceptible to cultism, for instance, you know, and I kind of use that term broadly. I mean literally cults, but also to the sort of cult of a political party too, where they, you know, simply go lockstep with whatever that side is saying is, you know, the du jour belief system, or, you know, whatever you want to say. But we'll see how that turns out. We have our son, you know, turned voting age this year. He's 18, so we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that at a certain point in my life, I got invited to both an extreme leftist political party and an extreme right political party. So there's two different conclusions that one can take from that. Either I am simply politically promiscuous, or it is true that if you go to the extremes, they end up touching. So
that's a really interesting way of looking at it, and there may be a lot of truth in that. I think that when I look at what's happening now, I see a lot of similarities.
Yeah. It's
they're overlapping in a very big way.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the authoritarian side of things, I mean, I guess that if you compare communism to fascism, there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, if your sole purpose is consolidating power, that's what you're going to get.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you another thing. You've already touched on this earlier. When you get in touch with, for example, your reader's interpretation of one of your stories, how often is it that they hit the mark in terms of what was in your mind while you were writing a passage, for example? I mean, do you get in touch with those kinds of things often, or not?
I think that here's what's interesting. What really comes to mind is, first of all, I think that generally they're right about a lot, but it depends on the way they're reading it. I had a reader who is also a writer who very rightly pointed out that my novel, The Hungarian, which is a historical spy thriller that takes place in 1956, was a satire on communism. And he was absolutely right. Most of the people who read that novel read it as a straight thriller and did not pick up on that at all. Both interpretations are right. You can read it as a straight thriller and not recognize that it's got a very strong satirical ribbon running through it, right? But you know, it was interesting that this man picked up on that right away. It was like, oh my God, this is a satire. And it was so funny. And this one passage was hilarious. And, you know, and he really just nailed it. He knew exactly when I was trying to be funny. And I think that, or trying to be funny, he knew exactly when I saw the inherent comedy, rather, of a certain scene. I wasn't really trying to be funny, but I was writing the scene in such a way that it really would have happened, potentially. But I was writing it in all seriousness, right? And I think that 99% of the people who read that novel would not have seen that. would have simply taken the scene for what it was. Oh, well, this is what that character did. Um, so, it's more whether they see, it's more the the amount of what they see, I guess, in what they're reading, than seeing something that's completely different from what I intended, if that makes sense. Um, and probably because they bring their own, experience to this. I don't know how it was that this reader who reached out to me about it being a satire. Maybe he just read a lot about the Cold War, and that was, his last name was Gallagher, so I knew he wasn't like an Eastern European immigrant, right? And I knew that he hadn't had it through personal experience. He was this, like, Irish guy, but clearly he had an interest in that because he was able to see the sort of, inherently darkly comic situations that system
Hmm.
was able to sort of create simply by existing. I was telling a story, and I think I told you the story about a communist propaganda play that my theater
Yeah.
years ago put on. And what was so funny about that particular play was that, it was written by this true believer, and at one point every theater in Czechoslovakia was required to have it in its repertoire and play it and perform it.
Yeah.
And so just a stroke of genius, what theaters started doing was playing it deadly seriously. And it was just a pathetic play. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was terrible. It was just terrible. I mean, it was horrible. It was so bad that it was cringy. And they decided that they were going to play it like with all their heart, like it was Shakespeare. And so, of course, the audience was laughing their asses off, and it became this satire, right?
Yeah.
But the government couldn't do anything about it because then they would have to admit that their ideas were inherently ridiculous.
Hmm.
So they would sit there seething while the audience was just, slapping their knees and laughing during this very serious play. And that's how my theater ended up playing it, because it was just so bad we couldn't figure out how we were going to put our audience through this without, so we just decided that we were going to play it the way they would have played it. And and the Czechs who came to see it, they were like, oh my God, it brought me back. It just brought me back. It brought back so many memories. And so anyway, all the material was there, but certainly the author who wrote that was very sincere about his beliefs and had no idea that people would be laughing at his work.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, I did have an idea that some people would be laughing at the Hungarian, but I had no idea how few. The opposite. It's like one person understood that it was a satire, that it was really a satire. One person.
Yeah, but that's interesting because that also makes us think about how comedy works, because people have to have certain references to find something funny. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I mean, a group of people could be laughing their asses out when they read or hear a particular joke, but another group could think, okay, what's funny in this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you've heard the term clapter.
No.
Okay, it's kind of new, but when I heard it, I thought, God, that is just so funny. That just sort of in right now in comedy, at least in the U.S., I don't know if it's going on in Europe. There is comedy where stand-up comedians are still saying things that they shouldn't say,
Yeah.
but there's also this whole branch of comedy, I guess. I mean, it's sort of dominant. That's about getting applause for a point of view. And it's really not about being funny anymore. Not so much, about going out there and being like, I hate Trump, and then waiting for the applause, as if that's some kind of, as if that's a funny statement. You know what I mean? Because it's not a funny statement. It's a belief, right?
Yeah.
But it's not an inherently funny statement. An inherently funny statement is making a comment, is making some sort of, audience interactive comment about maybe Trumpism or Trump himself, but saying I hate Trump isn't funny.
Mm-hmm.
But it is funny to some.
Do people laugh at that? I mean,
Yes.
probably the ones that are ideologically aligned with the comedian.
Exactly. That's where clapter comes in, where it's not a laugh that comes from sort of this laughing at ourselves, which I think great comedy allows us to laugh at ourselves as well and our own foibles and other people's, and it needs to be sharp. It needs to have teeth. It's got to get you in the neck. And it has to be an equal opportunity offender in order to really be effective and in order to get us to think about an issue deeply, which I think comedy does. And, I think comedy is like great comedy is smarter than we are.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I don't know if you agree with this, but I have this idea that, as you said before, comedy is a serious issue, but it's basically about learning not to take ourselves too seriously.
exactly, exactly. And it's a way of very safely looking at our own foibles, I think,
Yeah.
and of being able to let our guard down. And I think that is not in fashion right now so much. I think it'll come back. I think it always does. But it's just not in fashion right now.
Yeah. And do you think that it's mostly because of the SJW type leftists, or do you find that also that pushback against comedy from the right? Because traditionally it was more from the right, I guess. But
Traditionally, it was from the right. In fact, I feel like 5 minutes ago it was coming from the right.
yeah,
But in the last few years, it has come very forcefully, I think, from the left. And I think I think it comes from this sort of religiosity that we were talking about. Because when it was coming from the right, it did come from a place of religion, usually. Of
yeah,
that's not funny. I mean, I grew up going to Catholic school hearing that's not funny, young lady, because I was always the person making the cracks in class. Right? That was me. And I couldn't stop myself. I knew I was going to get in trouble. I knew it. And back then they were allowed to hit you,
yeah.
you know, and I couldn't help it. It would just come, I'd be like, it would just come out of my mouth. And then everyone around me would start cracking up and everyone was shaking. And then Sister Margaret Ann, Victoria. I mean, I can still feel that now.
Yeah.
And that has, I think as we have sort of gone away from it, like my kids don't understand that at all because they haven't experienced it. They didn't go to Catholic school. They went to Sunday school, but it was very groovy for the most, my daughters experienced their first like old fashioned Sunday school teacher last year when the woman they loved left and stopped teaching Sunday school, and they got a truly old-fashioned Sunday school teacher, and they just couldn't believe it. And I was like, girls, I was raised by people like that. Not raised, not in my house, but I mean, that's what most of my teachers were like when I was growing up. That's how we got Saturday Night Live in the 1970s. That's how we got Bill Murray,
Yeah.
and ironic humor. That's how all of that, you know, and stand-up comedy. That's how we got Pryor and Lenny Bruce. And even though a lot of those comedians were Jewish, they were reacting to the greater culture, and now
George Carlin.
George Carlin, my God, I grew up, oh my God, listening to George Carlin in secret in my basement because you don't do that, as a Catholic girl. And now That's Not Funny, Young Lady isn't coming from Sister Margaret Ann anymore. It's coming from the SJW crowd or whatever it is. It's coming from the other side, and it's a really interesting shift. And one I didn't have an imagination for 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when I really just thought that to be something that happens only from the religious right, that they're the ones who don't find anything funny.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's
I was just
weird
thinking
cultural
that
shift.
I was just thinking if it would be possible for George Carlin to have been a comedian nowadays, because he was basically hitting left and right. I mean, he was after everybody basically all the time. So.
Oh, I think that if you look at Chris Rock routines from, a dozen years ago, he couldn't do them now.
Yeah.
Or he couldn't do, at least I bet he would not feel comfortable doing some of that material. And it's hilarious. And it skewers everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I even remember some, I mean, I shouldn't say I remember because I'm from the 90s, but I've watched some 80s comedy movies done by, I can't remember the actor's name now, but for example, was it The Plane? The title of the movie, or Airplane.
Airplane.
Yeah,
My
Airplane.
favorite movie.
And I mean, you have a lot of what could be considered sexist, racist, even Islamophobic comedy there.
There's not a single group that movie doesn't take on. I mean, my kids, because we kind of inculcated them in comedy from a young age too, because my husband and I just love it, and he, like me, was that kid making the cracks, in class, and he remembers getting hit with a ruler on the back of the head, and all this stuff, But my kids are always quoting the part in Airplane where the little kid comes into the cockpit and the pilot starts saying very seriously, making pedophile jokes.
Yeah.
Absolutely verboten now, where he'd be like, "So, Billy, have you ever seen a grown man naked?" Stuff like that, and says it like he's saying, "Have you ever played basketball?" or whatever. And all of those things, which are, all those topics.
Yeah. I mean, lots of it is edgy and even sometimes cringy, but we still left it.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah. I mean, I really miss those times. I wasn't alive in the 80s and the 70s, but I've watched things like Monty Python and Fawlty Towers.
It's fantastic.
And Allo Allo. Have you watched Allo Allo?
Wait, what is it?
Allo Allo. That comedy series.
Hello.
That comedy series that is about that occurs during the Second World War, and there are French people, there's the French resistance, and then there are the Germans. I mean, it's,
I don't think I've seen it, which is
probably perhaps the title. No, but it's a British series, so
I love British comedy. So
yeah. I mean, and I couldn't imagine people creating those sorts of movie series nowadays.
No, and I wonder, I mean, is there any good comedy coming out of Britain anymore?
Uh, well, perhaps someone like, oh my God, I'm forgetting a lot of names today, but um, Ricky
Gervais. Oh yes. Oh
Gervais.
no, he's great. He is so
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
He's a real anomaly. Yeah, and we do have a handful um, of those comics, who just are take no prisoners and refuse to go along. And I think that more and more of them are coming up, and that more and more people are feeling comfortable laughing again. But
Well,
I think that
I think that George Carlin was in jail at least a couple of
he
times.
was, I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
Probably blasphemy laws were still on the books then, and we're I mean, human beings are interesting. I think that we now have our own version of blasphemy laws, in terms of the language rules that are being set up, that are non-religious but yet have a very religious emotional base, if that makes sense. They come
Yeah.
from a religious place, even if they're not typically, religious, the way, we might have described it 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting to watch that go, and I wonder, because I'm my husband and I are talking about endeavoring to write some comedy again, and I I just don't know. I mean, I think I can still very effectively weave dark humor into my serious stories that the one person who reads it gets, right? But I don't even know if I have the ability to write comedy. No, I have the ability to write comedy. I just don't know that it would um, resonate anymore. I think that it probably would with a certain crowd that I would have to, seek out, and then there would be a whole other uh, group of readers who would take it deadly seriously and say, "This is horrible. This is a terrible person writing this. I can't believe that I was even reading it," you know, without recognizing that they were reading that it was making fun of itself. That the whole purpose was that this was a joke, and so I don't know. I'm not sure I even know how to write um, a comic novel, for instance, in this environment that would work. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I'm sure it would. I mean, I think comedy is comedy, and I think that it must be subversive in order to really be effective, and that you always have to be going against the grain. And, that which was the resistance 30,
Yeah.
40 years ago is now the dominant culture, but yet still thinks of itself as the resistance. That's what's so interesting about it. I think they still think of themselves as the underdog, and, that without sort of recognizing that, no, there's been a cultural shift. There's been a very, very big cultural shift.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we were saying that in comedy you can basically explore all different avenues and don't take yourself too seriously, because that's what people that go against comedy do. They take themselves too
Very
seriously, and
serious.
their ideas and their
Yeah.
convictions and their beliefs and their values. Uh, because I mean, the greatest comedians ever, I guess, at least in my opinion, were the ones that were able to make jokes about even their own beliefs. So, I mean, the left, the right, the religious, the non-religious, I mean, they would be able to joke about anything and be hated and loved by everyone at the same time.
Well, yeah, that's true, and I mean that is what's so. I mean, we were talking about George Carlin. I mean, that's what was
Yeah,
so delicious about his work, right?
yeah.
Because he had grown up Catholic. He was a lapsed Catholic, obviously, but he had all the Catholic baggage, and he knew it. And so which is why he resonated with Catholics. And it wasn't that, and certainly there were plenty of Catholics who probably were angry about it because they took themselves very, very seriously. But most people, even if they still considered themselves people of faith, right, who watched George Carlin, recognized themselves in him. Mm-hmm. And even if they would not go as far as he did, right? We were all there, and we were all right there with him. And that is what's so wonderful about going to comedy shows, and I miss going to stand-up comedy shows. We were just about to start going again, our kids were old enough, and then COVID hit. So, we couldn't go to the shows that we had lined up. But it is so fun to go into that venue, not just to laugh, but to actually be able to step outside of yourself and laugh with other people. Yeah. Who may or may not be anything like you. I mean, it's an incredibly bonding experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I find so wonderful about certain art forms. And I think that reading can be like that, even though it is a very intimate experience. One of the questions that you posed to me, when we were having our exchange before a couple of days ago, one of the things that we'd wanted to talk about was, why do people read? What makes reading different? Yeah. And I think that what makes it different is that two things. It's a very intimate experience. It's you and the characters and the world that you've stepped into. And unless you're being read to by someone, it is really just you with those characters. So you feel like you are getting to know them, I think, in a way that you don't necessarily get to know them when you're watching a television show, even though that is also very intimate because you get to see them. But it is also, it's a partnership between the reader and the writer, because the writer gives you certain elements of what this world looks like and what these characters are like, but you really get to run with them. Mm-hmm. You get to imagine what, largely what the protagonist looks like. The writer might have said, oh, he's got dark hair, or he's got very expressive eyes that, are the deepest green, or whatever it is. But there's a great deal that as a reader you get to fill in. Mm-hmm. And so it feels very personal. It feels very much like it's your own story that you can take with you into your own fantasy world and into your own sort of fan fiction universe, in a story that you really love. Whereas, when you're watching a film, for instance, that's all done for you. Mm-hmm. But I think perhaps where the intimate experience comes in is that it's all done for you, but it's in your very living room. Yeah. And you can share it with others too. You can sit there and you can share it. You can have a simultaneous experience, with your friend or your family or whatever it is, and you can all be watching Game of Thrones together, or whatever it is, or Lucifer, or the new Perry Mason series, or Homeland, whatever, all the sort of really quite wonderful series that are out there that you can now, experience with someone else, and then you can talk about it together. But reading is intimate, and you have to seek out other people who perhaps are reading of certain series that you have really become immersed in, and you can now find them online. And so, certainly you can make it a sort of group experience, but it is very, very intimate.
Yeah. By the way, I asked you about your readers' interpretations of what you write. what about literary critics? Because, I mean, there are lots and lots of writers and movie and film directors and so on that they simply say that critics are really annoying, even that they shouldn't exist, that they always get things wrong, that they are so full of themselves because they always know what the author meant with that sentence or with that paragraph or with that scene in the movie or something like that. So what do you think about them?
I don't know. I mean, look, I've read some wonderful critiques, but they're rare. They are. They're really rare. Oh, that was, sorry, a bird just flew into my window. Poor thing. But they're very rare, and they usually, come from a very gifted writer who has an artistic sensibility themselves. And that's probably not the way most critics become critics. I think that they probably just sort of fall into it and end up writing
Yeah.
for, a periodical or whatever, or a newspaper or an online magazine, however they fall into it. And so I don't know that. It's also, I think that, what we were talking about with comedy and what you're allowed to say and what you're allowed to like. I don't know how accurate literary critiques are right now because of the environment. I think that a lot of people are very careful about what they say and about what they are supposed to like. So I don't know that it's of any, I don't know how much value it brings right now. And that coupled with the fact that, everyone is now a critic because everyone's leaving, their critique on Amazon, or on Goodreads or whatever the platform of your choice is. I've actually found, when I go through and I don't read them very often. I just don't have, it's just kind of not having the time. I think when you first come out with a book, oh my God, you're just waiting to read every single review that you get. But really, like as things progress and you're writing other books and you move on, you tend to only read the first few and see where it's trending, and then you kind of forget about it. But some of these are really well written and are really quite good that you get from your readers, and they're very genuine. And the people who are writing them are not thinking about anything but their own experience. They're not thinking about what the readers of their newspaper say would think of this, which I think a writer who writes for a certain publication is thinking about that. They're always thinking about that. They're also thinking about their own reputation. Oh, well, what if I say I like this, and this critic over here who has more power than I do says that it's garbage, or the reverse, and I think that so many other things come into play that, when you read a review from a reader who has left it on Amazon, that person really doesn't have much expectation that they're going to have, people clamoring to hear their point of view. You know what I mean? They're really just like they're writing in a diary almost, saying what their feelings are about this work. And even the ones that are like really scathing are really interesting. You know what I mean? Because the fact that this person was so mad that they decided to sit down and write a bad review instead of just moving on, or the fact that they even finished the book, I find amazing, because I wouldn't have, if I hated something that much, 9 times out of 10, unless there's something really weird and fascinating going on in the story, and you just have to see it through because it's such a train wreck, I walk away from a story that's just not engaging me. So I think you can learn a lot if it's a genuine scathing review, I think you can learn a lot from it as a writer. You also get people who clearly did not read the story and are firebombers, just like you do on Twitter, but those are pretty rare, unless for some reason somebody decides that they're angry with you personally, and so they create a bunch of sock puppet accounts, right? And then they start writing terrible reviews for your stuff. That happens on occasion. That happened to a friend of mine, actually.
Really?
Yeah, it was really intense. I mean, she started writing historical fiction, and she'd been a music writer. I mean, she'd written, she'd been based in like Atlanta and Nashville, and she'd written about music, and she was very savvy about the way she got into historical fiction too. And she really got a lot of her sort of the fans of her music journalism on board with the fact that she was writing about the Tudors. She has a British husband, and and would do things like, what would Anne Boleyn be listening to if she were alive today? She was really clever about it. And she had a book launch, and on the day or a couple days after her book launch, she had like 50 one-star reviews that just popped up. And it was clear this person hadn't read it, that they were just angry, and it was clear that it was coming from the same person, even though they were all different accounts. And she had a friend at Goodreads, so she was able to find out who this person was, and it turned out to be, a professor at a university who'd like gotten teaching awards. And of course they had a historical fiction book that had not done well. And she actually reached out to this person, and I was like, don't just ignore it. She was like, no, this is a reasonable person who I think is in pain, and I'm going to reach out to them, because if you're going to spend all of this time, I'm thinking about how many hours it would take to create 50 sock puppet accounts to firebomb a single book for whatever reason, right? And so she reached out to this person, and she said, hi, I know it's you. Please don't deny it. I'm not here to get you into trouble. I'm not going to out you on social media. I just, I took a look and I saw that you have a historical fiction book out, and I just wanted you to know, I know how frustrating it is to write something and to have people ignore it, to put your whole heart and soul into something and to have people ignore it. And if you had reached out to me, I would have helped you market your book. I would have given you advice on it. And this woman ended up taking down all of her bad reviews. Now, it still torpedoed my friend's launch, because to get 50 bad reviews in the first few days of your book being out sucks. But she was able to recover from it. But it was such an interesting experience. And I really had to hand it to her that she reached out to this person and was very kind about it. She wasn't looking to embarrass this woman. She wasn't looking to out her, as I said, on social media. She really just reached out to her in a very personal way, and they were able to come to an understanding. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you were saying that there are people that even if they hate the book, they read it through to the end. One thing that came to my mind was that scene. Have you watched Curb Your Enthusiasm?
I've seen every single episode. Every single one.
Yeah, there's that episode where Larry David goes to the movies with someone, I can't remember who, and he's hating the movie, but he's still there, and he says that he's going to watch it until the end, because he always do that. Even if he starts a book that he hates, he reads it to the end. I mean, that's really funny.
That is really, really funny. I admire that. I think that's great.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically the sunk cost fallacy. Okay, I'm already here. I'm going to finish this, even if it costs me 50 hours of my life.
Exactly. I'm seeing this through the bitter end.
Yeah.
Well, there's also something delicious about hating something, isn't there, though? About truly hating something.
Hmm.
It's why, like, I had a friend in college who used to make me, well, it was cassette tapes back then, which I'm sure you have no frame of reference for.
No,
But
I have. I'm
okay.
from the 90s, so I still
So you did still have some cassette tapes, but
yeah.
she used to make me cassette tapes of like truly awful music. And she had a friend whose father was in the music industry or something because she was from New York, which was like unbelievable to me because here I was this suburban girl from Chicago, and I had this friend who had a friend whose dad was in the music industry and so she was able to find like the cringiest songs where you couldn't even believe that someone had actually recorded this and it was a professional musician, someone had written this, but also, and she would mix it up with really cringy songs from the 60s and 70s that we remembered, and so she made just the world's best hater tapes. And we used to sit around listening to them and just laughing. So there's something really fun about hating something. We were talking about 50 Shades of Grey, I think, last time we spoke. And
Yeah.
that's something, I think part of its popularity is that there are people who really love it, but it's so fun to hate it too. And so the people who hate it write, 3-page critiques of it on Goodreads of the
Yeah.
book, and they're hilarious. There is this one woman who basically like made a name for herself on Goodreads reviewing that series because her reviews were so funny, and you know they just killed you. And she was a true hater of the series.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, she still bought the book, so I guess that L.
well,
James wasn't.
she exactly she read the first book, and she said the only thing that made it bearable was that she read it aloud to her younger brother. And they could laugh about it together. She was like, it's just so freaking bad. But her review just took off like wildfire on Goodreads. And she ended up having like 50,000 people following on Goodreads. And she was just a reader, she wasn't, um, she was just a reader. I mean, that's it. And so she was like, well, okay, so I guess I've got to review the whole series now. And
Yeah, maybe
her two
turn the
reviews were,
reviews into books.
yeah, her other reviews were really, really, really funny too. But I think that the first was the gem because it was so genuine. It was just it was just so genuine.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that somebody could have done that about Twilight as well.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, there's just some things that are so fun to to hate, I think, and to make fun of. I mean, I remember watching Twilight with my daughters, who my older daughter hated the books. I'm just books. She didn't read the books. She started reading the first book and just couldn't stand it. She was like, "This is terrible." But we watched the movie, which was a lot better than the books, and it was really, really fun. Oh, I hate disparaging books like that. I really hate to do that because look, this book hit something. People loved it, and this
Yeah.
story really resonated with people. And it was written by a talented individual. I don't like to do that because it clearly it rang a bell and it rang it loudly and it got people's attention. But part of the fun of watching Twilight with my daughters is the fact that it was just so blatantly eye candy. And I remember my daughter just squealed at one point because she looked and she saw that the actor who played Edward, that they had like not drawn, but like used makeup to give him a six pack.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? She's like, oh my God, that's makeup. That's makeup. They've used makeup to give him a six pack. It was so fun to watch it with my girls. And it was a very different experience than if I would have sat there and watched it alone because I'm not a teenage girl and I'm not, I just don't want to watch it. You know what I mean? But with them, it was an absolutely joyous experience.
Yeah, it's funny. That reminds me of, I mean, there was a time with one of my ex-girlfriends that she was an extreme feminist, and I made her watch The Beauty and the Beast.
Oh my God.
I guess you understand the joke here, right?
Oh, yes.
Oh my God, and it was just all the time she criticizing the movie because Belle was under Stockholm Syndrome, and
Oh,
the Beast was full of toxic masculine traits or
oh,
something.
whatever. Yeah, I know. It's just it's so funny. You know, when when I was first kind of looking at it, you know, writing this fantasy series, right, that I was telling you about, um, that I'm in the midst of, you know, there was a romantic element to it, and it's a pretty strong romantic through line, and so I thought, well, you know, I really want to understand this mechanism, and I want to make sure that I give readers what they want to, you know. That's I do think that that's important as a writer. I think that you have to, you know, we're talking about not completing story arcs, right? You and I had talked about that, of how unsatisfying it is,
Yeah.
no matter how artistic a book might be, say, or a story might be. If a character doesn't complete a story arc, it's just not satisfying. And there are certain tropes and certain story arcs and certain genres that I think are really important. You can, you know, you can play with them, you can bend them, but you really break them and shatter them at your own peril, right? Because it for good reason can really turn off a reader and take them out of the experience. But so I you know, I was just sort of going through different books in the genre, everything from sort of more literary romances, which are truly which are just truly wonderful. They're just great fiction that happen to have a strong romantic element. But what I thought was interesting was watching how the stories changed as the culture changed. There are certain things that are just so ingrained in us that don't change. You know, that continue to resonate no matter what cultural shifts there are. But you know, if you look at some of the racier novels, romance novels of like the '60s and probably into the '70s, maybe into the '80s, I don't know though. There is still a lot of rape fantasy in them. And it really is, and it's kind of shocking to read it coming from where we are now, you know, and you're like, oh my God, that's horrible. And you know, right at the last second, she's like, oh, okay, you know what I mean, and it's all okay because she gives consent at the very last minute. But when you think about it, that makes sense because there was still an expectation of virginity then.
Right.
So that was the fantasy, right? That you're not supposed to want this and you're supposed to resist it until the very last minute. And now what you have, I think what the trend is, and maybe, I don't know, maybe this trend is starting to go away. I don't know, because I haven't been following what's happening immediately, right? But now you have like the alpha billionaire romance. But you look at that and you think what's going on in our culture, right? There's a lot of single mothers out there now who are having to work and raise their children by themselves. Really pretty much all but wealthy women or wealthy-ish women can stay home and raise their kids and not work.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot more, you know, there's just a lot of stress and there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of responsibility out there. And so what do you want to read, I guess, as your romantic fantasy? Someone who comes in and takes that responsibility away, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a very interesting book. I don't know if you read it. I think the title is A Billion Wicked Thoughts. Have you heard about
No,
it?
but that sounds
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
The title gets me interested.
Yeah, it was, I think two researchers that basically used Google to search for people's preferences, and basically when it came to women's mate preferences, there were 5 categories that stood out, that were women preferred pirates, werewolves, vampires, billionaires, and I can't remember the last one.
Oh
But
my
it
God,
was something like
that
that.
is one of the funniest things. That's really, really great.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was back in 2011 or something like that. But
If an alien race came in and studied, women's mating habits and preferences, they would think that women were into billionaires, werewolves, vampires, pirates, and whatever, and soldiers, maybe Rambo. I don't know. Maybe that's antiquated now. Oh my God, that is so so funny. That is
yeah,
so fast.
there was also another thing that they found, that across the world, in terms of porn websites, and this is really interesting. One of the favorite body parts of men was the penis. It was the fifth. So, and I don't know how you explain that, but
Oh my God, we are such funny creatures.
yeah,
We are just such funny creatures.
yeah,
It's
you have to read that book. It's
I
really,
would love to read that book.
yeah, yeah. Well, I was talking about my ex-girlfriend and the Beauty and the Beast. So, but by the way, another thing that I wanted to ask you is, when writing a book, are there big differences between writing it from a first-person perspective and a, let's say, third-person perspective?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting, kind of. I think a lot of people probably, at least when they start out writing, um, choose one of those by default. It's because that's just sort of what they're used to. But and I think that writing from a first person perspective um, is very intimate, but it's precarious because familiarity can breed contempt. And so I think it takes a very seasoned writer. Let's put it that way. I think unless you just are one of those people who simply have a real flair for that perspective, um, very naturally, and those people certainly exist. Um, you have to be pretty seasoned to be able to pull that off, because you you have to you're bringing a reader in very close to someone,
Hmm.
and as a result, that reader can get really sick of that person by
Right.
the end of the story. And um and I think that it's helpful probably to have some kind of device that keeps it fresh. I mean, one of the things, um I wrote my historical thrillers are in third person, but this fantasy series Breath that I'm writing is not only in the first person, but I'm writing it in the present tense, which is a little more unusual. It's very immediate.
Yeah.
And um, I think that what I hope, and I don't know, but
Yeah.
what I hope keeps the reader engaged and not um, what gets them not tired of the narrator, is the fact that she sort of becomes a different person, but with similar character traits in each
Yeah.
novel and in a different time. Because I'm not sure that I have the skill
Hmm.
to stay with this one iteration, this one person in this one time for these really lengthy books, because they're thick. They're fantasy length, they're epic fantasy length books, for several books. I think that I would tire of her and the reader will tire of her as well. And with me, I think I can kind of tell when at least I hope, you really just don't know until people start reading it. But I can tell when a reader's getting tired because I'm getting tired.
Sure.
And so, I kind of am tricking myself and the reader by bringing her into a different time and into a different body and into a different experience each time. And I think that works. But, that's tough. I mean, but it's, I think one of the most brilliant and probably rare devices is having someone who doesn't like the subject of the story narrating, like Salieri narrating Amadeus, this person who is so jealous. I mean, there's just really nothing better than that, right? I mean, how great is that, right? To have an enemy narrating this story about a genius, right? And so,
well, I guess
that's a great trick.
I guess
that's a great trick to get you to like a really unlikable person, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because Salieri is not likable.
No, not at all.
And yet he becomes incredibly engaging and keeps you engaged instead of turning you off, So what a terrific trick that is. But yeah, I mean, it really just depends because it's it's interesting when it's third person, you have the added ability to talk about subject matters and scenes and places and things that happen that your protagonist perhaps didn't see. And so it gives you a little more leeway. You're under, you can get deeper, obviously, into a character and into their feelings when you're writing first person, but you are still writing from their point of view. So if something is happening that is happening, that is outside of their scope, outside of what's going on with them personally, you have to think of a very clever way to introduce that information.
Yeah, I think that one very good example of someone who took a first person experience or perspective to the limit and managed to pull it off was Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky, because I don't know if you read it, but
I didn't know.
Because it's about basically the first person perspective of a nihilistic man, and he's really an awful person, and it's very nauseating at times, but it's very sincere. So
yeah,
he managed to pull it off. But anyway, Dostoevsky is one of the greatest writers ever. So yeah.
I know, and I read so many of the classics when I was much younger, and I really had time to absorb them. And I feel like I'm going to dive back into them after, my kids don't need my attention the way they do right now. It is so hard. It has been so hard, as raising young children, to be able to read what I want to read, for one thing, and also to be able to dive into stories like Dostoevsky's, which they're so immersive, but they require so much, and so I look forward to doing that, because you're right. I think he's just the best. I don't know, maybe Nabokov is right up there too, and they're all the Russians, right? I love Tolstoy, Milan Kundera, the Czech writer. I love Milan Kundera. Yeah, Chekhov. I mean, there's just something about it. Eastern Europe that really
I don't know what happens in Russia, but I don't know if it's genetics, if it's the cold environment, if it's vodka, or
I don't either, but they're so brilliant and on so many levels that it's just it's awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I think that they are even better than people like Shakespeare and Dante and Homer. I mean, even those guys that we consider to be top of the top. I mean, I think
Right.
that the Russians are even better than them.
I do too. I suspect it's because, in part, they go to very dark places, and they go there in a very uninhibited and unself-serving way. Um, that I find very compelling. I think that I mean,
And
I
it's
love Shakespeare. I mean, I absolutely
yeah,
love Shakespeare. I think it's just
sure.
so wonderful, and his plays are wonderful. And I think that his view on humanity is really interesting, and it's very comprehensive. But I think that even Shakespeare will not go to some of the very dark places that an Eastern European writer, a Russian writer, a Czech writer will go to. They will look at their own souls in a way that I think is, I don't know, not palatable, I think, to a lot of people. We've talked about how we wonder if we'd be that person who did the heroic thing in a concentration camp, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, um,
Oh, well, talking about concentration camps, another great Russian writer, Solzhenitsyn.
yeah, oh my God, yes, I know. I mean, and and I think more often than not, people want to believe that they'd be the hero in their own story,
Yeah,
and of- not even necessarily the villain, but just the person, the coward. Nobody wants to believe that they'd be the coward in their own story,
sure.
you know, or that they do something petty. That's almost worse than villainous, because there's a glamour to villainy.
Yeah.
Um, there is no glamour to cowardice. There's no glamour to pettiness.
I
It's
mean, there are many instances where the villains are even more interesting than the good guys, let's say.
exactly. I mean, that I think happens so often in film because film can really bring out the charm in a
Yeah.
character, right? To watch something like, The Silence of the Lambs, and you have a villain like Hannibal Lecter who's a cannibal and who is certainly fascinating, and and it's written in a way that's meant to be interesting, but he takes over the film. I mean, he absolutely dominates that film. And you want to be you want to go hang out with him, and you just hope to God that he doesn't eat you, that he finds you interesting enough to keep you around. And that also plays to your vanity, which I think is so great like a reader or a watcher, right? Is that you think that you won't be the one he eats, that you'll be Clarice Starling, that you'll be interesting enough that he wants to keep you around, and he thinks that you're worthy of remaining as part of the human race, And I think that Dracula and has a really similar appeal. I mean, I don't know if you've read the original Dracula, Bram Stoker
Uh, I'm not sure.
novel.
I can't remember.
It's one of my favorite novels.
Yeah.
It's it's just so good, and it's so Victorian, and it's just dripping with repressed sexuality. And Stoker was gay, but he was married. He was in, I think, a largely sexless marriage, and he was in love with Walt Whitman, and and all of this. And he's like this Irish gay guy in Victorian times, and it's just you know the book is like a pressure cooker of that, and yet it also is such a love letter to the Victorian times as well, which is what's so beautiful about it. And the character of Dracula, um, hovers spoken and unspoken throughout the entire novel, even though he really only um, is actually like a physical character in the story a couple of times. You know,
Yeah.
you meet him a little bit in the beginning, and then you really just catch glimpses of him after that. And yet, it's called Dracula for a reason. It's not called Jonathan Harker and Mina Harker and Van Helsing, go get Dracula, go get a vampire. You know, it's called Dracula. And um, I think that the reason why that character has has endured, you know, and has created an entire, you know, horror genre of vampires is because it's also this person. Not only are they fascinating because they've lived now for, you know, our hundreds of years, and so they have this incredible grasp of culture and history, and so you imagine this very erudite person, this very cultured person, but who is also makes you vaguely uncomfortable, you know, or maybe not so vaguely uncomfortable, depending on what your perspective is as a reader, you know, what you're bringing to it. But there is that sort of vanity um, of reading that, of does he want to make me one of his brides, or does he um, like me enough not to kill me? You know, do I qualify? You know, like am I Clarice Starling in that situation to Hannibal Lecter? You know, am I interesting enough? I think that it creates this really seductive character, but part of the seduction is our own vanity.
Yeah. Well, another suggestion, since we talked about villains, there's a Japanese anime that is an anime for adults, it's not for children, that's called Monster. I think you would like it because it is okay. So the action goes on in Eastern Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and it is after, I can't remember exactly. I think it's after the Second World War or after the Cold War. It's something like that. I think it's after the Cold War. It's after the end of the communist regime, I think. Yeah, and basically it's the story of a doctor that saves a child that got shot in the head, and then the child becomes, or is already, but when he becomes an adult, he is a psychopath basically, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a great villain because he doesn't kill or harm anyone directly, but he convinces people or manipulates them into committing suicide, and even manipulates entire criminal organizations to do things for him. He doesn't do anything directly, and
What a
is sorry.
what a fascinating character.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a great story. It's and basically the doctor to try goes after him to try to bring him down or bring him to justice. But I mean, I'm not going to spoil the rest, but I think you would love that story, and it has lots of Eastern European and German elements to it. So
That seems very heavily influenced by Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
yeah, yeah, probably, yeah.
Have you have you have you read that original story? I don't know if they're into like classic horror, because I went through I went through a whole classic horror phase, but I loved Frankenstein as well. I thought that was just an amazing book. But it sounds like Monster has a lot of those elements, but you know, updated and with a really interesting twist.
Yeah, and another very interesting element to it is that you get to learn the background story of the boy and his family, and basically he became an orphan in Eastern Europe, and then he goes through an orphanage where they are basically making some experiments with children to I'm not sure what's their goal, but they make some experiments with them, and that's they give you the background story, and then you can sort of empathize a little bit with the villain, and so it gets a bit messy because you want him to be the villain, but at the same time you understand that he went through a lot, and so I mean it's not at all a black and white story. So,
Is he charming?
yeah,
Yeah.
he's charming, but he doesn't. He doesn't seem to be interested in women or men. I mean, he's a handsome guy, but I'm not sure if he uses that in his favor because he doesn't seem that sexually interested or something like that. But
Which is,
it's
yeah.
yeah, it's a great story, and I mean the anime I think has 70 something 20-minute episodes, so yeah, I think you should look into that.
I would love to look into that. That sounds like something that is right up my alley. That's a very difficult character to write. I think that takes tremendous skill to
Yeah.
write a character that first I think that writing a villain that people don't see as a straight villain that they can empathize with, I think is tricky. It's really, really tricky and can be difficult to do. But then to add the element of this villain never does anything directly, but is able to manipulate circumstances in such a way as smart enough, which
Yeah.
takes a really brilliant person, is smart enough to be able to manipulate people so completely that he can get, a criminal organization to do his bidding as a game,
Yeah.
just for his own amusement, because he's not interested, say, in sex or men or women or personal relationships. He's interested in the game.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, he's not interested even in his own life because basically, okay, so this is a bit of a spoiler, but he basically kills his adoptive parents. I mean, he's adopted together with his sister, and then as a child, basically, he asks his sister to shoot him in the head. So. To shoot him in the head, yeah. So yeah, it's very intense and
Wow.
yeah, it's very intense and a very very dark story, but and extremely dense and complex. Yeah.
That sounds incredible. Reminds me of the character of Kathy in East of Eden, in Steinbeck's East of Eden, who,
Yeah.
is this, beautiful woman who has a look of innocence to her, but is a sociopath, right? She, I think she kills her parents as well, and she causes one of her suitors to commit suicide, and does so many horrific things, and is able to get away with it all, or is able to lure people in because she knows how to behave like the person she looks like,
Yeah.
and people mistake the person she pretends to be for her, for who she really is, and get sucked in, and then it's usually they usually find themselves in a pretty bad situation as a result. Those characters are amazing. I have so much admiration for writers who are able to create characters that are that seductive and
And there are even
tasty.
yeah, there are even characters that it seems that they are sort of endless in terms of how you can explore them. For example, the Joker from
Yeah,
Batman, right? I mean, you
yeah,
had several different actors playing him. Each one played him differently.
yeah.
Most of them were brilliant. I didn't like the Jared Leto Joker, but anyway, the others were really, really great, and even the most recent one played by Joaquin Phoenix. I mean, it's he won the Oscar, and he really deserved it because
I thought he was very
it was,
good too.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
incredibly nihilistic, and yet they somehow managed to combine nihilism with this real empathy for that character, which I think that like something like A Clockwork Orange doesn't do. I mean, I think I did. I mean, maybe you felt differently, but with A Clockwork Orange, I did not have empathy for that character. I thought it was a very nihilistic, purely nihilistic kind of film. Um,
Well, maybe
I
in the
didn't read the
second,
story. I didn't read the book. I only saw the film. But
yeah, maybe
film,
this in the second half of the film, it's easier to empathize with him when he's put through
yeah,
all of those things to try to brainwash him, basically.
yeah,
Toward the end, it's easier to
it is.
empathize with
It
him,
is. It does let
but before he gets caught, no, you can't really empathize with him.
no, and at the end with Joker, with Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, when he finally makes his psychotic break, I
Yeah.
guess, and becomes the Joker. Um, it'll be interesting to see if we, as viewers, take our empathy with us into the next story, the next iteration of that story, when he is the Joker. He's not becoming the Joker. If we're able to still remember who he was, or if he's even going to reference that, man in pain who was struggling with mental illness and then eventually had the psychotic break. I wonder how in subsequent stories, if Joaquin Phoenix keeps playing the Joker, how much, if at all, they're going to reference the Joker became the Joker, or if he is just from then on going to be that character, and whether or not that's going to be as effective. I really don't know, because I don't know what they're planning for the series, who knows how many times Joaquin Phoenix will play the Joker. Maybe never again, maybe just one more time, but I'd really be very, very interested to see how they handle that.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if what many things that we see in the movie really occurred, because he also seems delusional, and
Right,
some of the stuff obviously didn't occur, but there
right,
are other things, particularly the end when he goes to the Murray show, or I'm not sure
yeah,
what's the name of it, but he goes there and then he's taken by the police and all of those things happen. But right at the end, he's at the asylum. I'm not sure if all of that stuff was just in his mind or really happened.
yeah. I know it's really hard to say, and when the story is no longer centered on his experience
Yeah,
solely, on his
yeah,
point of view, it'll be kind of interesting to see, like, what do you do with him when you put him with Batman, you know?
yeah,
And I mean, I would have a lot of empathy for the actor playing Batman against Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, because that's such a compelling character. And to have to rise to that and create an equally compelling Batman, but not be able to do all the sort of delicious things that the Joker can do because he's the villain,
yeah.
that is being the straight man, basically. That's a really, really tough spot. And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I know that they got the Twilight actor, who, I don't know if you saw him in The Lighthouse, but God, that was so good, with Robert Pattinson, right? Robert Pattinson.
So, yeah.
Sorry, there's a Robert Patterson here in my neighborhood.
Okay.
So um, it's the father of my daughter's schoolmate. So Robert Pattinson was in a movie called The Lighthouse, with Willem
The
Dafoe.
elections are coming. So.
I know. And it's just, I mean, I highly recommend it. It's really good. It's very dark, but he's really good in it. And and I guess he's now playing Batman. And is he playing Batman opposite of Joaquin Phoenix's Joker in this next iteration? I don't know. I haven't kept up with it, but I imagine he is, right?
Uh,
The next
I,
Batman, Joaquin Phoenix is in it playing Joker. Is that
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there's the Joker there, but I'm not sure if it's played by Joaquin Phoenix.
okay? Okay, so maybe not. Maybe it's a moot point. But I was thinking, God, I mean, how do you after that movie and after establishing that character, who was, the central character of that movie, which is unusual in and of itself in that sort of comic book universe, I guess, at least in the film versions. How do you, what's Batman look like in that scenario? You know, it could be really good, or it could be a very difficult uh, partnership.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because that movie doesn't have the tone of a mainstream movie. It's more like a sort of indie movie, like you see at those kinds of minor festivals, let's say, or even
Yeah,
a Cannes festival, for example, in France. And even so, it really got a lot of got a big audience.
it did. It did. It was and deserved it.
Yeah.
I thought it was really well done. It was interesting. My husband didn't like it as much. I think he thought it was too nihilistic and he sort of lost interest in it. But I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. And I was surprised at how much I liked it. Because I guess I tend not to like things that are too nihilistic. They just kind of, they bring me down, I suppose. And I want to see a little more uh, hope for humanity. I tend to want to see a little more infused into it.
Yeah,
But
and I guess that if it's too nihilistic, then it becomes self-indulgent, I guess.
yeah, exactly. But I loved the movie. I thought it was terrific. I so enjoyed it. And I would absolutely go see another movie with Joaquin Phoenix playing the Joker.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
me too, me too, me too, me too, and this is not the other me too.
no,
Yeah. Okay, so we've been here for almost 3 hours now.
again, see, I don't have glasses on, so I can't even see what time it is. I know this kind of seems to be our MO that we go for 3 hours when we start talking about books and movies and characters and stories, but I could do this all day.
Yeah. Yeah, me too, me too. I guess that you are one of the few guests I have on the show with whom I do sort of a Joe Rogan experience type of show that runs for 3 hours.
Well, you always very science-minded people on, which I love. I mean, I love science, so I love listening to your episodes. There I have one flagged about she's a I want to say that she's like an archaeological psychologist or something like that. Was that correct?
A cognitive
Cognitive
archaeologist.
cognitive archaeologist. That's it.
Yeah,
Which I thought I thought that would be really, really, really fun.
yeah,
But I know. I feel like I am like that you're slumming with me because because we talk about fun and fiction instead of all of these very smart scientific endeavors that your other guests are involved in.
Well, you can be sure that if I wasn't interested in these sort of conversations, I wouldn't be here for 3 hours.
I know. It is. It's so fun. I mean, I could do it forever.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel almost 3 years ago, and I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page or PayPal, because I need your support, and any amount starting from $1 would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Perarga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Thiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, and Tom Roth. My producers is Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luis Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michal Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Brett. Thank you for all.